first time from Minnesota to Minnesota. So I think we've scheduled 2 hours. I promise I'm not going to take 2 hours today, but I will allow plenty of time for questions at the end. This will be real informal. If you have questions as I go, feel free to hold up your hand. Just, a point of clarification, wherever you need. We'll keep it real loose today. So let me go through and click over to the agenda for the presentation. I'm going to start kind of broad today, okay, and then we'll narrow it down as we go. We're going to start by talking about the retirement living landscape in general. All of you are probably in different places in your research process up to this point, and so we want to make sure everybody understands what all the different choices out there are for retirement living, and then we're going to narrow it down from there and talk a little bit about a continuing care retirement community in general. We'll talk about some of the implications of age staying at home versus moving to a retirement community, because some of you may still be trying to figure out what's best for you. And then finally, we'll dig into different types of resident payment plans, contract types, and we'll look at some financial comparisons with the life care contract that Trillium Woods offers and some other types of contracts that are out there. And then again, we'll end with some questions. Before I get started, I'd like to hear a little bit from you guys. And so my question is, what brings you here today? Now, aside from seeing the invitation and knowing that I was going to be speaking here, because I'm sure that's why you're here, right? Aside from that and the food, why are you here today? What is your underlying reason for coming to learn or be educated a little bit about continuing care retirement communities or Trillium Woods in general? Somebody get us started and tell us a little bit about your concerns or why you're here today.
Comparative costs.
I'm sorry?
Comparative costs.
Okay, comparative cost. Okay. So you want to see some of the different numbers and so forth. What else? What are some reasons why you're here? Why are you interested in a retirement community? Yes?
You've already made the commitment to become residents at Trillium, but we need to become re-educated as regards to the financials.
Okay. Become re-educated in terms of the financials. But let's dig even deeper than that. Why are you really here? Why do you want to know the numbers? Why are you interested in Trillium Woods? Why are you interested in a retirement community like Trillium Woods in general? What appeals to you about it? What are your objectives?
We'd like to think that the medical care would be on the campus itself.
Okay, the medical care will be on campus itself, all in one place. What else? Let's talk about, next slide, called the biggest worries about living a long life. Now this may seem somewhat oxymoronic because people say, what do you mean? Everybody wants to live a long time, right? People are living a lot longer today than they used to. People are very active, well into their 90s and beyond. But with that comes some concerns, right? Some need for planning. So I'm going to show you a chart here that you may not be able to see. You should all have copies of this. But Merrill Lynch did a study a couple of years ago, or last year I think, with in conjunction with a company called AgeWave. And they surveyed the 65 plus population, asked, what are your biggest concerns about living a long lifetime? Well, the number one concern was serious health problems and what to do about that. The second was not being a burden on my family. Any of you have that concern? Is that a reason for any of you to be here? I see a few hands up. Running out of money to live comfortably was the third largest concern at 47%. Being lonely, 26%. Not having a purpose, and then finally having nothing left to leave my children or grandchildren. So we're going to keep some of those things in mind as we go through this presentation today. So let's talk about some of the different options. Of course, when you're planning for your future retirement years, where you're going to live, where you're going to receive care, what you want, what your objectives are, obviously one of the choices is to stay in your home. Then they have active adult living communities, independent living or rental retirement communities, co-ops, and continuing care retirement communities. I've got a little prize for somebody who can help me explain the difference between these. One of the problems, see, in the industry is just all the different titles and labels of all the different types of choices, and there's a lot of confusion from the consumer's perspective. So who could tell me, for instance, what's an active adult living community? Have you ever heard that term? How many of you have ever heard active adult living? And who knows where that is? One with a golf course. Yeah, quite often. What else? Anybody? Any guess?
Adele Webb community?
Adele Webb community. Yeah, very good. So Adele Webb community, basically active adult living is a community that's just like any other neighborhood. You buy a home, and there's other people who are 55 and older in that neighborhood, and you maybe pay homeowners insurance dues for some services, but that's it. There's no health care on site. It's really just living in a neighborhood. So that's an active adult community. But the problem is you go online and you search retirement communities, and they use that same term for all these different, they might call a CCRC an active adult community. It's just very confusing to people. So again, I think it's important for everybody to have this baseline understanding. Now let's talk about our, oh, by the way, this is a really nice platinum back scratcher that doubles as a shoehorn for you. So, he answered too. You pass one to this gentleman. I've only got one of those left now, so if you really want it, you'll have to speak up. Independent living, rental retirement. Who can tell me what that is? What's a rental retirement community or an independent living community? Yes, ma'am.
I think Good Samaritan has one, and it's an apartment type setting that offers meals, and you pay a rental fee.
That's right. You pay a rental fee to be there. Is there any health care on site?
The one I had experience with did have a little bit, but I don't think they usually do.
That's right. Yeah, it did have a little bit. Most independent living communities will have what's called limited services, or sometimes they're called independent plus communities, meaning everyone that lives there is able to live independently, but they may need some help as time goes on with a few things, daily activities, but it's very limited in its scope. They typically don't have a health care facility on site. Usually it's just bringing somebody into their home for a couple of hours a day, if that. So very limited in terms of assisted living, skilled care, things like that. Co-ops are another thing. Oh, you get my last back scratcher. And then co-ops, of course, are the next one on the list. Co-ops are really nothing different than an active adult living community that we mentioned a minute ago, except for the fact that you purchase, instead of purchasing a home, you purchase shares in a corporation, kind of like a membership. So that leads us to continuing care retirement communities. This is pretty much the full scope. You either stay at home or you move to a retirement community. These are kind of the descriptions of what's available out there. So let's talk about CCRCs for a minute, continuing care retirement communities. Often referred to as full service retirement communities or entry fee retirement communities. They were first started about 75 years ago in the form of a life care concept, which is actually what Trillium Woods offers, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. But the one thing that's unique about CCRCs, this gentleman mentioned a few minutes ago, is that they offer all the different levels across the full spectrum. Independent living, assisted living, skilled care, all on one site if you need it. But what's really important about that a lot of people overlook sometimes, is not only do they offer these things, but they're contractually guaranteed, and that's the big difference. It's a contractual thing where you, as a resident, will have access to those health care services. That's very different from any of those other choices where something happens and all of a sudden you need care. Typically, families go into sort of emergency response mode, try to figure out where to go and where's the best care. Here it's pre-planned, it's contractually guaranteed. So what comes with that? Peace of mind. All those things, if we went back to that chart, not being a burden on the adult children, social isolation, all these things can be addressed in a CCRC, which is why they're so appealing to a growing number of people out there. Now, resident payment plans are going to vary from one community to another. So that's another part of the confusion on behalf of the consumer a lot of times is understanding the payment plans and how those work. One of the things I want you to be sure to think about is the idea of cost of care versus access to care. Now, I've got a quote up here from an article that was in Financial Planning Journal a few years ago, and the article was more about long-term care insurance and CCRCs and the interface between those. But the point that the article made that I really like is that cost of care is a separate issue from access to care. You might have plans to pay for care. The question is, where will that care be received? And that is just as important in terms of planning for your future. And CCRCs some of them address one half of that. Some of them, like Trillium Woods, actually can help you address both sides of that equation. Cost of care and access to care. So, what are some of the popular reasons for choosing a CCRC? We've already talked about the 3 levels of care on site, which is nice. We've talked about not being a burden to adult children, or on the adult children, which is nice. Are there any other reasons that might be appealing to you? Yes, sir.
Before I ask this question, is there any one of those gifts left?
Sorry, I'm all out. Fresh out.
At the life care portion of it, that guarantee and the financial deductions on the medical expense.
Right, yep. So there's some tax benefits, potentially. Yep, that's another big one. So, anything else? Guaranteed access to care, peace of mind, vibrant campus lifestyle. You hear that a lot. Maintenance-free living, not having to deal with the home and the upkeep of that. Services and amenities. The intangibles is a big part. What do I mean by intangibles? The social aspect, total wellness. Retirement communities today are giving a lot of focus, an increased focus on not just physical wellness, mental wellness, total wellness, which more and more studies are showing can have a tremendous impact on your health in a positive way. So the idea of total wellness, these intangibles, that's a really important aspect. More and more articles are pointing to social isolation as being a health risk. Now, as a retirement community, the end-all be-all in terms of providing you or keeping you from being socially isolated, not necessarily. You might move to a retirement community, move to Trillium Woods, decide to stay in your home all day long, and that's certainly up to you. But there are so many more opportunities to be involved. When a retirement community gets involved with service projects in the community, or activities within the community, all of these things. So there's plenty of outlets to keep you engaged, which I hear from more and more people is a very important reason for choosing a retirement community. Let's talk about some of the considerations of aging at home. I'm curious to know how many of you are still maybe on the line, decide, is a retirement community right for me, or should I stay at home? Many of you still back and forth, or most of you already crossed that? I see a few hands. Okay, a few hands still trying to decide. It's a tough decision. There's a lot that goes into that decision. Let's think about some of the things that come with staying at home, though. Will my home eventually need to be modified to accommodate changes in mobility or health? Ongoing home maintenance and the associated cost. When people were kind of doing the analysis on the monthly budget, staying at home, move to a retirement community, you kind of go through all the things that you spend money on and what will be paid for when you move to the retirement community. But what's often overlooked is all these one-time big expenses. You know, the roof needs replacing, HVAC goes out. It seems like in my house, every time something breaks, it's $1,000. $1,000 here, $1,000 there. I don't know why. Every time something breaks, it seems like it's $1,000. But in fact, I heard somebody say their HVAC was out this morning who was walking in. So these things happen, and you've got to consider that when you're doing your calculations. How will I stay socially active? Who will provide for my caregiving needs when I can no longer care for myself? If that's ever the situation, do you have family nearby that's going to be able to do that for you? And if so, would you want them to do that? Are they able to do that physically, emotionally, financially? Are they able to do that? What might be the financial and emotional impact on that family member? Who will provide transportation? Who will manage the process and the scheduling of care? I hear people say sometimes, well, we'll just hire somebody to come in the home. Well, that's a lot easier said than done. Somebody's got to manage that process. Somebody's got to care for the care managers and make sure they're doing a good job. Make sure there's no neglect and things like that going on, or something else. Somebody's got to manage all of that. And then ultimately, again, if the time comes when you're no longer able to receive the care that you need in your home, where will you go? What's the plan? So those are just some of the challenges of staying at home. Now there's obviously some benefits too. People like to stay in their home. It's where they've been. It's where their memories are. But my point is, whether you choose that or not, the key is to give it a thoughtful, really be thoughtful in your decision-making process. And I commend all of you for being here, because you obviously are already doing that and planning ahead. So congratulations, because too many families don't do that. So here's another quote. I like quotes, if you can't tell already. This one was from Forbes magazine a couple of years ago, and it was talking about this very topic, aging at home. And it says, it can be sensible under certain circumstances. Eventually, however, staying at home turns into aging at place, a term that generally means you'll need help living on your own. So let's talk about that for a minute. 65 million unpaid family caregivers in the United States. I don't know if you can see these or not. The estimated economic value, the economic impact of that is $450 billion. 17% of caregivers feel health is worse as a result. 30 to 59% have symptoms of depression, which can lead to other health problems. 50% say caregiving takes time away from friends and other family members. And 57% withdraw funds from their own retirement or savings accounts to help a loved one. Now let's contrast that a little bit. A survey was done several years ago. Family members of people who have parents or loved ones in a continuing care or life care community. 93% agree that CCRCs are providing good services to their loved ones. 77% would be likely or very likely to consider a CCRC for themselves. And I'll tell you something that's interesting about that. Take Pennsylvania, for instance. They've got more CCRCs than any other state in the country. And do you know the reason why? It's because they were one of the first states to have a CCRC. So those family members, the adult children, over these generations, have seen the benefits, the demand's been there, and they've grown and grown and developed more and more. So to me, that says a lot. 75% of those surveyed report that their family members' experiences positively influenced their interest to a great extent. And then finally, 98% would strongly recommend these communities to others. So that's a big difference between what we saw in the previous slide and the impact of taking care of someone at home. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the different types of contracts. There's a lot on this page. Ideally, I'd be going through them one at a time, but let's start on the far left, okay? The first three that we're going to talk about are what we would call entry fee contracts. Let me stop and ask you, how many of you feel like you really understand the difference between the types of contracts offered among different communities out there? A couple of you? All right, let me ask you another question. How many of you are comparing communities right now, maybe considering a couple of different ones? Okay, all right. So if you're doing that, you may come across some of these different things. So I want to make sure you have a good understanding of it. So let's talk about the first one, type A, often called a full life care contract. This is the type of contract offered by Trillium Woods. And basically what happens is that you're paying for unlimited care for the rest of your life. Your monthly fee, in other words, is not going to increase to reflect the cost of additional levels of care. Now,
What if you have long-term care insurance?
what if you have long-term care insurance? That's a popular question. We'll talk about that. If you can, I'll come back to that in just a little bit. So what's going to happen is your monthly fee is going to remain level. Now, that's not to say that there won't be just basic inflationary expenses and things like that, but it's not going to increase each time you need a higher level of care. Okay? Yes,
Does
ma'am.
pre-K for unlimited care include memory care?
Does it include memory care? Yes. It can vary from one community to the next. That's why I'm looking over here. And so they're telling me yes, at Trillium Woods it does.
A set fee?
I'm sorry.
Do they have a set fee or is it your regular monthly fee?
Is it a set fee or is it your regular monthly fee? I'll defer to you guys about that on the memory care.
It's the monthly service.
It's all
It's all included.
all
in the
included.
monthly fee.
So what's the benefit of a life care contract? Predictable future expenses. You essentially are able to cap what your lifetime outflow will be. You know what those monthly expenses will be generally, and you're basically passing that risk on to somebody else. Now, I'll tell you something to really think about with the life care, where the benefit really is important. I don't know how many of you know anybody that's been in this situation. I'd imagine several of you have. My great-grandmother, I think she must have been in a nursing facility for 6 or 7 years or longer. As long as I can remember when I was a child, she was in. I never got to see her. I just remember my grandmother saying she's at this place, you know. And it seemed like my whole childhood she was in there. I think she died when I was 10 or 11 maybe. She lived to be over 100. But she was in that facility for a long time. Do any of you know people that have been in a care facility for an extended period of time like that? Yeah, so the big thing here is that extended period of time in a care facility, if that's ever required a life care contract, you don't have to worry about running through all your assets and so forth to pay for that. Yes?
Is there any cap on the inflation fees?
Is there any cap on inflation fees?
Inflation fee increases.
No. I don't think there's a cap. I'm going to talk general about these types of contracts. If you have specific questions for Trillium Woods like that, they probably would be better to answer those than I would. I'm going to give you an overall context, help you understand the difference between these. Those more detailed questions about the community in particular, you may be better asking them after the presentation. Let's flip over and talk about a Type C contract, the third one, the middle one. I'll come back to Type B in a minute. Type C is going to be the opposite. Okay, a Type C contract, basically, all things being equal, you'll probably pay a lower entry fee, but if you ever need care, that monthly cost is going to increase. For assisted living, it'll increase again for skilled care. So you're exposed in terms of what your out-of-pocket could be for health care down the road if and when you need it. Now, one of the things I'll say a lot is all things being equal. I always use that phrase because conceivably, a Type C contract could have a higher entry fee than a Type A contract. You know, if a Type C contract, if that community is, you know, on the San Francisco Bay overlooking, you know, it all depends on where it is, location, amenities, services. But all things being equal, you'll generally pay less up front, but those monthly costs can really add up if you ever need care. Type B is going to be right in the middle. Okay, Type B, often called a modified contract. They're usually going to pay, you'll get some type of a discount off the cost of care. So it's not like full life care where it never changes, your fees will go up, but not as much possibly as in a fee for service. So in other words, maybe they give you a discounted rate off the cost of care, or maybe they give you 60 or 90 free days of health care in their care facility or something like that. So it's kind of right in between those two. The last two are going to be rental and co-op communities. A rental retirement community, basically there's no entry fee, but you're either going to pay a lot more on a month-to-month basis, since there's nothing up front, or if you're not, then it's probably going to be kind of a, you know, limited type of services and so forth, maybe a lower income type of place in some situations. So the charts at the bottom, these are not drawn to scale by any means, and they don't reflect inflationary increases, but they just kind of show you how, with life care, that entry fee and then everything's flat after that. You know, you don't have that increase for cost of care. And then you can see the other ones where you pay a little bit less of an entry fee, but those costs can go up. So again, they're not really to scale, but they're just to give you conceptually an idea of how that works. Any questions about those contract types before we move on? Yes, sir.
Now, there are all sorts of rating agencies to rate everything.
Right.
Bonds, stocks, financial. is there any sort of an entity that rates these CCRs? And how many have run into financial trouble, or are they simply employed?
Yeah, okay, so the first part, how many are the CCRCs rated by any independent entity? Some of the nonprofit communities that issue bonds for financing do have ratings, not all of them. They have to, they have to make the decision of where they want to have those bonds rated or not. So the same companies that you're probably referring to, Standard & Poor's and Fitch, those are the two big ones, they'll sometimes place ratings on debt at CCRCs, but it's a pretty small percentage. Outside of that, there's really not an independent rating group available. One of the reasons that I started my company, LifeSite Logics, was to be kind of that independent source for information on retirement communities. Now, we don't rate them, that's the difference, but that was very much part of that, is being that independent source for information. So, no, there's not that big group. The consumer really has to do their own research. Now, in terms of how many of them get in financial trouble, very few. Very, very few on a percentage basis. Now, back when in 08, the financial, the chaos that we had then, there were a few bankruptcies, and those were, obviously you hear about those. They're in the paper, you see that. But on a percentage basis, it's less, I think it's about 1% that have actually gone bankrupt, maybe even less than 1%. So on a percentage basis, it's very, very low. Yes, sir.
Is type C covered under the medical expense deductions?
Medical expense deductions? Yeah. I've actually got a couple slides on that.
On type C?
No. You're generally not going to get a medical deduction on type C. I'll talk with you in a minute about how that deduction works. Type C contracts, you're not paying for any care in advance. It's all as needed, so you don't get any deductions up front or on a monthly basis. Any other questions? Yes?
All of the articles you read say that if you're going into a retirement community of any type, the first thing you should do is do some sort of financial analysis of the economic makeup of the corporation running it. If you say there are no rating agencies, where in the world do you go to get that information, and are there state filings that perhaps would have some of that information?
CCRCs are regulated at the state level, so it's going to differ from one state to another. In the state of Minnesota, I don't recall whether there's a state level entity that.
Then you do have regulations under Statute 273 for the state of Minnesota.
Okay, all right. So where you would go though, obviously you can talk with an accountant and get a copy of the financial statements, an accountant. You also want to find out about who's managing the community. That's a big part of it. And one of the benefits of Trillium Woods is, of course, the backbone Life Care Services. It's either owned or managed over 100 communities. I don't think any of the ones that they've ever developed have ever gone bankrupt or had financial troubles. So a big part of that is having an experienced management team, and Life Care Services certainly brings that to the table with communities like Trillium Woods. But you can get a copy of the financials and have an accountant review those and things of that nature. Yes, anything else? No? Okay, so one of the things that is a response to the market demand, I guess you would say, is return of capital contracts. A lot of communities will offer a return of capital. Trillium Woods offers one. I'm going to use the example of the one Trillium offers for this presentation. They're all going to vary. You might find some that are 50%. You might find some 75% or more. Trillium offers an 80% return of capital. Basically, the way this works, if you're not already familiar with it, is that 100% of your entry fee, if there's two of you, it'll be the total entry fee for both of you, is going to be refundable for the first 4 months that you're in there. So if you move into Trillium Woods for 4 months, anything changes, you get all of it back. beginning in the 5th month, the community is going to earn, that's kind of the language that we typically use, is that they're going to earn 1% of that entry fee for 20 months, 1% a month for 20 months. So if you were to move out, or something happened and you had to move out in the 10th month, you'd get 95% back of the entry fee. The first person entry fee. The bulk of the entry fee, if there's 2 of you, will be that first person fee. I think it's additional $12,000 for the second person. So you'll get 95% back. If you move out in the 10th month, you'll get 90% back. If you move out beyond the 20th month, you're going to get at least 80% back of that entry fee. No matter how long it is, either you or your estate will get that 80% back. So, in other words, at no point will you get back less than 80%. You could get back more than 80% if something were to change in those first 20 months. Does that make sense? Any questions about that?
A little bit confusing that, since the first 2 years refund will be 80%.
Will be, yeah. So within the first 2 years, your refund will be at least 80%, is what I was trying to say there. If anything changes within those first 2 years, it'll be at least 80%. Beyond that, it's always going to be 80%. Yes.
This is a rather attractive part of the contract. The question I have is, what do they do with that money? And what guarantees or collateral do the residents have that when it's time to pay that back, that it'll actually be there?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll say something about that, although again, I would say, I don't want to speak for Trillium Woods, that's not my place, but what I would say, almost every one that you're going to find, I'd say the large majority of CCRCs that we've researched, and we've looked at over 1,000 contracts at our company, they generally will say that the residence has to be resold before that refund is paid. Now, there's good and bad to that. A lot of people say, well, gosh, you know, how long could that take? Or, you know, I have to wait and these kind of things. But the flip side is, going back to financial stability of the community, it's a big benefit. In fact, these rating agencies, one of the things they ask is, does the unit have to be resold before the refund's paid? And the reason they ask that, if the answer is yes, it's going to help them get a better rating. Because essentially that means no units are going to be sitting empty, because there's always going to be cash flow with those units. So oftentimes that's what happens, is the refund's paid out of reselling that unit. But some communities handle it different ways, and again, I would be sure to ask the Trillium team about that. I'm probably not the person to answer on their behalf. Any other questions? Yes.
So does the person have to pay the monthly fee even if they're not there until it's resold?
Sometimes yes. Don't know how that works at Trillium. No. Okay. Yes.
I know that there's a place in Oklahoma where they have a beautiful setup like this, but the problem is that if that complex is building new apartments and new,
Right.
then they're not going to try to sell, if you're sold, they're going to be trying to sell the new ones.
The new ones. Yeah.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, she said there's a community in Oklahoma that's adding on, and her concern is that they're trying to sell the new units and not the other ones. You know. Yeah, and I don't know the answer to that. I think it's something to be aware of. You know, I'd say the benefit with Trillium being a brand new community, that's one place where you probably wouldn't run into that as quickly as you might at some of the older, you know, communities. But certainly that's something to ask about. Anything else?
Thank you for rephrasing that question. Would you do that for all of them?
Yes.
Very well.
I'm sorry. Yes, I will. Anything else? Okay. So here's a few things to take into consideration when you're looking at retirement communities and these different contracts. Consider the potential cost over lifetime. Don't just look at the upfront cost. You want to take into consideration what could be the cost over the course of my lifetime in that community. Taking into consideration whether you ever need care or not and what that could cost. Do you want your future monthly cost to be predictable? to be capped regardless of the services needed or not? That's a preference. That's a preference. Some of you might say yes, some of you may not. You know, people are different. We all have different personalities. Some of us are risk acceptors, and some of us are more risk adverse. Some of us want to play the averages, some of us don't. It really comes down to your personal preference and how you prefer to plan. But that's what you really want to ask is, do you want those monthly costs to be capped? And again, when I say capped, I mean that in the sense that your health care expenditures don't increase. Understand whether the contract's inclusive of or a la carte. The reason I say that is sometimes a community will say their monthly fees are such and such, but then you find out it could be an additional $1,000 or so per month because you have to, you know, these other services you may want or need cost extra, versus a community where it's basically just all included in that monthly fee. Do you own long-term care insurance? So somebody mentioned that a minute ago. Let's stop and talk about that. So who asked me about the long-term care insurance? Yes. And you asked, your question was whether in a type A community, long-term care insurance makes sense to have that. How many of you have long-term care insurance currently? Okay. Of those of you that have it, do you know whether it is what's called a cash benefit or a reimbursement plan? Is that making, do you know what that means? Cash benefit. A cash benefit plan, this is something you should know about your policy if you don't know. A cash benefit plan means when you meet the qualifications for a claim, which is usually needing assistance with 2 activities of daily living. Usually, some companies will say 3. But once you meet that and have a letter from your doctor stating that you require those services, they're going to pay you the full monthly benefit for that policy. It's not a reimbursement situation. Maybe your care costs $2,000 for that month, but your benefit's $5,000. They're going to pay you the $5,000. It's not, you don't have to submit receipts or anything like that. A reimbursement plan, on the other hand, you have to submit a receipt for services, and they're only going to pay you for those services. The reason I bring that up, when you, at a life care contract, I'm asked that question a lot. Does it make sense to maintain my long-term care insurance in a life care community? And I generally say yes. And the reason, there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, particularly if it's a cash benefit policy, you can come out in a really good situation from a cash flow perspective if your fees are not increasing for care, but yet you can still get that benefit from that long-term care policy. That could really be a pretty good thing. Now, if you have the reimbursement plan, it might work a little bit differently in terms of how you would submit reimbursements in a life care community. I've heard different ways of that working, but I'll give you a couple of examples. Let's say you just want to bring in some care at your home before you ever go into the care facility. You want to bring in a little bit of care at your home. You can use your long-term care insurance to do that. Or you could, if you don't want to maintain the full benefit, just reduce it, you know, and lower your premiums that way. Dropping long-term care insurance, to me, is, some people might, but generally I don't recommend that. It might lower the benefit, you know, which would lower your premium dramatically. Now,
what's the first type of benefit? What do you call it? You modify the benefit. What's the word?
For what? I'm sorry.
What's the got 2 types? Reimbursement
or
and a benefit. But what kind of benefit are you calling it?
I'm calling it a cash benefit, which cash, C-A-S-H, which basically just means they're going to pay you that full cash benefit.
Thank you.
Yes, sorry. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, in the reimbursement, I'm not clear about if you actually get reimbursed if you're in a full care community at all.
Yeah, if you're in a life care. It depends on how they bill that, and I don't know. I might let Trillium Woods answer that. I've heard some communities that are not able to do that and others that are able to do that. It just depends on how, if they start to bill that as a medical expense when you're in the health care, even though your actual fee doesn't increase. If it's then billed as a medical expense and not an independent living expense, then you may be able to deduct that. But I would have to, I can't speak for how they would work.
No, I just think it would be helpful if there was a Trillium person up there to specifically answer the question.
Yeah, they're going to come up as soon as I'm done, and they'll be able to answer these
all
things.
these questions.
Yes, sir. Well, I'm almost, in just a few minutes, let me go through these analyses, and then you'll be able to do that. Let me talk about this one. Is any portion of the entry fee, monthly fee deductible as a medical expense? Somebody asked about that a little while ago. Here's a slide on that. Tax deductions are only going to be available for communities that offer a continuum of care and that you prepay for that continuum of care. So number one, all those communities we talked about before, active adult living, independent living, you won't get a tax deduction in any of those places. There has to be a continuum of care. And then some or all of that entry fee must be non-refundable. Refundable fees are not going to be deductible because you're going to get those back. The non-refundable portion could be. All right, could be. Now, Trillium Woods, and I can tell you most retirement communities, they don't want to be in the role of tax advisor, so they're not going to tell you how much you can deduct or this and that. Your accountant, or you can talk with somebody at that community, the CFO or somebody like that who can tell you their formula for care, and then you can figure out how much of that's deductible by talking with an accountant. The monthly fees are also, in the life care community, going to be deductible sometimes. So it's not uncommon for the entry fee, that non-refundable portion, and also the monthly fees to be deductible anywhere between 20 and 40%, depending on the formula that community uses to calculate that prepayment of care. Now, to understand that medical expense deduction, this slide, one of the things it talks about is that beginning in 2013, anybody under age 65, you can only deduct medical expenses in excess of 10% of your adjusted gross income. So if I wanted to deduct medical expenses for myself, all my medical expenses would have to exceed 10% of my adjusted gross income. But they kept that number at 7.5% for those who are 65 and older. And it's going to stay that way through through December of 2016. And then at that point, it could go up to 10% for everybody. So right now, all of your medical expenses in excess of 7.5% can or may be able to be deducted. All right, so let's get to the fun part and talk about some numbers. Now, I don't expect you, especially those of you in the back, to be able to see this. I have a summary slide in a second that will have much bigger numbers. But I want to show you how I've done this. This is done on a calculator that I developed along with one of my partners called Decision Genie. What we found was a lot of people sitting at home with an Excel spreadsheet or a calculator trying to figure out, what's going to be the financial impact of my savings if I move into this community or this community. And so we built a tool that we felt could do that in a more efficient manner. And so that's what I've used. That's where this output comes from. Let me just give you kind of an overview of what I've done here. Again, don't feel like you have to see all the numbers because I'll explain it conceptually and you have it in your packet. But what I've done here is I've taken an entry fee of $430,000. And this is right from a Trillium's pricing sheet. $430,000, 80% refund. And the rest of it's hypothetical in the sense that I've just assumed that this person has $300,000 of home equity that they're using towards the entry fee. And I've also assumed that in addition to their home equity, they have another $750,000 of savings, investments, retirement accounts, and so forth. The first column, the first three columns, basically, we're showing income and expenses. And what I've done for this example, because it helps me highlight my point better, is I've just taken the monthly expenses to be at Trillium Woods, which for that unit was about $37,000, $38,000 a year. And I've assumed their income, for this example, matches that expense. So I've just pegged their income to the exact amount of the expenses. So you can see this column with zero basically says that there's no surplus or no shortfall between income and expenses. And the reason I've done it that way is because year 12 is when they start to need care. This is a single person in this example. We'll look at a couple in a minute. When they start to require care, you'll see there's still zeros here because that monthly rate is not going up to reflect the cost of care. It's going up a little bit for inflation. I just use 3% as an example. But there's no shortfall of income because, you know, again, those monthly costs are capped, so to speak. So over on this side, what we have is, okay, what's the impact of our cash flow and our total savings? So the person had $750,000 to start with. They used the entry fee towards their home, their equity in their home towards the entry fee, which didn't quite cover it all. It was a $130,000 difference. That came out of their savings, left them with $635,000 at the end of the first year. But by the end of this, even with 5 total years of care, 3 in assisted living, 2 in skilled care, they still ended up with almost $1.3 million at the end. Now again, I'm using a 3% rate of return. I'm using a 3% inflation rate. So when you net those out, it's basically zero growth. But it ends up at $1.2 million of assets. Now, what I've done, I've taken an exact scenario. I used all the same assumptions. The only difference is I've used different pricing. It's the only thing I've changed. So this is not the pricing of any specific community. I took kind of an average of this region and just came up with what I felt would be a good example. So I've taken $250,000, $180,000 less than the entry fee I showed before, and I'm using a 90% refunding it instead of 80, just to do that. In this case, you'll see those zeros don't continue. You have that impact. And then, of course, the numbers jump substantially for skilled care, which is the most expensive type of care. So you see that happening right here. And so what happens is, when those costs go up, that money has to come from somewhere, so it's going to come out of their savings, unless they have long-term care insurance, which we could use that potentially on either side. But what's going to happen is now their assets are actually lower than the one before, even though they paid $180,000 less up front. So remember when I say consider lifetime cost and not just the cost up front? So that's a $186,000 difference. Now that's in 15 years. That'd be more like probably $100,000 or so in today's dollars. But still, $100,000 is a good chunk of money. So here's the summary graph that I told you about. You pay significantly less up front on the entry fee, that top line. You see the assets, but the total out-of-pocket care is $317,000 difference total for that cost of care. And that makes up that difference at the end of $186,000. But here's where, let me show you, let's look at a couple now. We've got a couple. Now here's the difference, and here's where the life care contract really has an impact. If you have double occupancy and one of you has to go into care, this is not in the life care contract, I'm talking about in a different type of contract, a fee-for-service contract. One person's paying for that health care, and then the person who's still in independent living is paying for the cost of single occupancy in that independent living unit. So you've got 2 costs going on. And then, of course, if the second person goes to care, now you're both paying the cost of skilled care. So I'm starting with the life care contract again. All the same things, entry fee. That entry fee at the top should actually say $442 because it's an additional $12,000 for a second resident. I included that in the calculation. I just forgot to change it at the top. So we've got the same, everything else thinks the same except we're using 2 people this time. If each of them require that same amount of care, still they end up over $1 million, starting with $600, because you just don't have those increases for the cost of care like you did before. But let me show you what happens if we look at that exact same scenario as before, using a couple. The ending balance now is $319,000. That's a $693,000 difference. So that's both couples needing care for at least 2 years in skilled care, 3 years of assisted living. Okay? So almost $700,000 difference in that example for a couple. And again, I've got that graph summarized here. So that really helps highlight, again, the benefit of a life care contract is that the big risk that you're protecting against is that extended stay in the care facility. If that's the kind of thing you want to protect against and you want to know what your cash flow, what your outflow is going to be, then a life care contract is going to help you to do that. Okay, any questions about that? Yes, ma'am.